Last time we tried to get acquainted with some general characteristics of existential philosophy, which I described as not so much a position, a system, as a focus of interest. Philosophizing about human existence, self-conscious existence in a broken world. And the first example of that, historically, Søren Kierkegaard, himself a very earnest Christian, Lutheran, theologically very orthodox. Kierkegaard is perhaps most significant for the distinction that he draws between the two paths, as he calls it, two paths to becoming a Christian, the objective and the subjective, where the objective path, whether it be a path of natural theology or of historical evidences, or whatever, always seems to be incomplete, because there are always some unanswered questions that cause one to defer decision. In fact, the very nature of what Christianity is about, what Christianity affirms, is such that Kierkegaard finds it hard to think how the objective path could actually get to it with demonstrative proofs. However would you prove from neutral premises the reality of the incarnation? Something as historically unique as that. There are no empirical general laws about human nature and history to be premises from which you could deduce such a thing, you see. And so he finds himself saying, we are confronted by the unknown. By the unknown, and the translations always capitalize it. The unknown. And you get the feeling that that phrase, the unknown, he is echoing Paul's speech at Athens. You remember in Acts 17, where amidst all of the altars and temples of ancient Greece, Paul stands and said he's going to declare the unknown God. Him declare I to you. The point being that what is unknown by natural theology, what cannot be demonstrated by historical evidence, though it can be attested by historical testimony, you see, that's what Christianity is about. And as a result, confronted by the unknown, the best we can do is to express the unknown in the form of a paradox. A paradox. Literally, a paradox is one that seems contrary to what normally would appear possible, such that the eternal has now appeared in time. That sort of thing. Kierkegaard's Hegelian background, I think, is such that a paradox involves very often, I don't know that this is the way he uses the term all the time, but very often a paradox involves thesis and antithesis, but no synthesis that we can conceptualize. You see? You can say of the incarnate Christ that he is the eternal God here in time. If you like, he's God, he's man. Thesis, antithesis. But how do you get the two together in one concept? Now, I said Kierkegaard was a Lutheran, and particularly for Lutheran theology, that's a problem. Because on the doctrine of the incarnation, the Lutheran theology tends to say that the divine attributes and the human attributes don't interpenetrate. So you can't define the unity of the two persons in terms of the interpenetration of the attributes. Reformed theology talks of the interpenetration of the attributes. So you begin to conceptualize the unity that way. Some of you may be familiar with the Westminster Catechism, Reformed Catechism, which speaks of God as a spirit infinite in wisdom, goodness, love, and power attributes. Man as a spirit finite in wisdom, goodness, love, and power. Oh, you see, same attributes. Infinite in one, finite in the other, and so they can meet, and you can conceptualize the unity. You see. But with Lutheran theology, that's extremely difficult. And so I sometimes wonder if Kierkegaard would have cried paradox if he'd been a good Presbyterian instead of a Lutheran. You see, because of that theological difference. Or whether he might have said, well, we know in part, we see in part, rather than simply crying paradox. But in any case, what from the objective standpoint, in terms of the objective logical path, we know of the unknown, appears paradoxical. And the response, therefore, that's elicited subjectively, the subjective response, is response to paradox about the unknown, you see. And it's that he dwells on. One response might be absurd, echoing, if you will, Tertullian. You remember Tertullian's famous dictum about the incarnation? They say it's absurd. All right, I guess I believe what's absurd. Credo qui absurdum est. Referring to the Gnostics, who thought it was irrational. And then he goes on to argue it's not absurd. Granted a view of the goodness of matter, it's not absurd. But the echo here in the word absurd is pretty evident. However, whatever one says about it in terms of the rationality, obviously what we have in the objective path is what Kant called a limiting concept. Now, Kant uses that phrase. Sounds like Kant had taken a history of philosophy. Sounds like Kierkegaard had taken a history of philosophy course or something. He uses that phrase, a limiting concept, drawn from Kant. That is to say that for Kant, a limiting concept has to do with the phenomenal. You see, so that we try to conceptualize what would complete our understanding of the phenomena. And the concept of God we come up with is then a limiting concept that we adduce, postulate, as a matter of belief in order to round out the picture, a limiting concept. Says Kierkegaard, all we have about the Christ who appears in the flesh, you see, and I stress appears to catch the phenomenal note, about the Christ who appears, what we have really is a limiting concept, the incarnation. Historical reality, but we can't conceptualize what it really is. That it is clear. Almost as if he's to say, sure, there's a thing in itself there. But what the thing in itself is, we have difficulty conceptualizing. Yes. Except that God is in the flesh, reconciling the world to himself. Now, it's in the light of such confrontation by the unknown that the subjective path comes into play. And it is on the subjective path, then, that those inner passions begin to emerge. And I'd suggest that in order to see the picture says on Kierkegaard's stages on life's way. Stages on life's way. And Stumpf gives a pretty good account of this. There are really three stages that he's talking about: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. Now, the aesthetic is, of course, the world of the senses. Aesthetic in the European sense of sense perception, not just the arts. It includes the arts, but it includes social life. Without moral conscience, sensitivity, haunting the inner life. So the aesthetic is virtually an objective type of existence, living in the world of the senses, which Kierkegaard thinks can get awful boring. And he seems there to be echoing the book of Ecclesiastes. Whatever my heart desired, I kept back from it, kept not from it, and it was all vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. That kind of melancholy begins to develop. And you'll notice that on page 309 of the anthology, you have a 1.5-page selection about melancholy, which is interesting topic. He says it's hysteria of the spirit. There comes a moment in a man's life when his immediacy is, as it were, ripened, and the spirit demands a higher form in which it will apprehend itself as spirit. But man, so long as he's living in the immediate and coheres with the earthly life, you see, is, as it were, out in a dispersion and needs to come out of that dispersion and become transformed. But if that doesn't come to pass, if one's forced back and confined, as it were, to this earthly existence of the senses, melancholy ensues. So that the aesthetic stage is not inward